The autumn of 1812 had stripped the elms along the drive at Graves Hall down to their black scaffolding, and the house itself looked thinner for it, the pale stone showing every crack the summer's ivy had covered, the front garden overgrown where a gardener had once kept it clipped. Lord Benedict Ashworth, Marquis of Trevane, had not seen the place in 2 years. He had left it in June, in full leaf, with a letter of intent folded inside his coat, and a mother's instructions memorized like a campaign brief. He had come back in late October with the same letter, rewritten, and a date the Dowager had chosen for him. He was to court Cecily Graves, the younger daughter, the one the county called beautiful. He was to do it quickly. He was to do it before Christmas. His carriage slowed at the gate, and his eye went, as eyes do, to the upper windows. That was where he saw her. Not Cecily. The other one. The elder Miss Graves stood at the second-floor casement with her sleeves pushed past her elbows and a cloth in one hand, and she was cleaning the glass. The late afternoon light struck the wet pane and threw a column of gold across her face, and she did not know anyone was watching. Her mouth was slightly open. Her hair had come loose at one temple. She pressed the cloth to the glass in slow circles, and the carefulness of the motion, the privacy of it, the fact that she was not performing for anyone, stopped him in the carriage seat as though a hand had pressed his chest. He sat there for 4 full seconds before the driver asked if he wished to descend. If you have ever watched someone who did not know they were being watched, you know the strange authority of that stillness. Stay close. This story earns what it promises. Benedict stepped down onto the gravel. The front door opened before he reached it, and Cecily Graves appeared in the frame with her hair dressed and her best muslin pressed and her smile wide and certain. She was 19, golden-haired, and if the season had been kinder to the Graves family, she would have debuted 2 years ago and collected offers like calling cards. Behind her stood Mr. Henry Graves, their father, leaning on a stick he had not needed 2 years ago, his color poor, his coat brushed clean and thin at the cuffs. The household had been arranged for this visit the way a stage is arranged for an audience that must not see the ropes. The good silver had been laid out. The drawing-room fire had been lit for the first time in weeks, and the smell of beeswax polish competed with the smell of damp plaster that no amount of polish could suppress. A vase of late roses stood on the hall table, cut fresh that morning and arranged with an eye that understood proportion. Cecily took his arm at the door with a confidence that assumed she was the reason he had come. She was not wrong. She was the reason his mother had written to Mr. Graves in August. She was the reason the settlements had been discussed in outline with the family solicitor. She was the reason Benedict's coat was brushed and his boots were new, and his face carried the particular fixed discipline of a man doing his duty. He did not look up at the window again. He did not permit himself to look. The elder Miss Graves had disappeared from the casement by the time he crossed the threshold. She had, the housekeeper later told him, gone down to the kitchen to finish the bread she had started that morning, because the cook had left in July and had not been replaced. Eleanor Graves had not been told to prepare for his visit. She had learned of it the way she learned of most things that concerned her sister's prospects, which was to say by overhearing her father's quiet instructions to Polly, the remaining maid, and drawing her own conclusions from the silver being counted and the good linen being aired. The Marquis of Trevine was coming. Cecily was to be made ready. The house was to look, for a few days at least, like a house that still had staff and income, and a future that did not depend on what a titled man might offer a pretty girl with an empty dowry chest. Eleanor had cleaned the windows herself, because the windows were filthy, and because no one else was going to clean them. She had blacked the grate in the drawing-room. She had turned the chair cushions to hide the side the cat had scratched. She had arranged those roses in the hall with stems she had trimmed with a kitchen knife because the shears had rusted through. She had done it all without being asked, because being asked would have required someone to notice she was there, and noticing Eleanor had not been the household's habit for some time. Mrs. Whitfield, the nearest neighbor, had come by that morning to deliver a jar of preserved plums, and had lingered at the kitchen door with the particular gentleness reserved for women whose futures had narrowed to a single function. "Poor thing," Mrs. Whitfield had said to Polly, not quite softly enough. "The elder Miss Graves. She will be running that house until she is gray, and no one will think to thank her for it." Eleanor had heard it from the passage. She had not stopped walking. She had carried the plums to the pantry and set them on the shelf beside the last of the summer's jam, 4 jars of damson she had made herself in August, when the tree by the wall gave more fruit than the household could eat. And she had stood there for a moment, with her hand on the cool glass and her eyes closed. Then she had gone back to the windows. She was 24 years old. She had not had a season. She had not had a new dress in 14 months. She wore her mother's cameo at her throat, because it was the only piece of jewelry she owned. A small oval portrait of a woman with Eleanor's eyes and Cecily's mouth, and it sat against her collarbone like a quiet claim that no one in the household acknowledged any more. Her hands were roughened from lie, and from the garden and from the household ledger she kept locked in the desk beside her bed, the one that tracked every shilling spent and every shilling the family did not have. Between its pages, pressed flat and dry and still faintly fragrant after 3 years, lay a sprig of lavender her mother had placed there the autumn before she died. Eleanor had not moved it. She did not explain it to anyone. She turned the pages around it the way one steps around a grave that has settled into the ground and become part of the path. Dinner that first evening was an exercise in misdirection. Cecily sat at Benedict's right, radiant and conversational, carrying the table with an ease that came from genuine confidence rather than calculation. She asked about his time on the continent. She asked about the improvements to the Trevane estate, with the specific vocabulary of a woman who had been coached, and her interest was sincere enough that the coaching did not show badly. Benedict answered her steadily, his voice level and correct, his posture that of a man performing a contract he had agreed to perform. Eleanor sat at the far end of the table beside her father and said almost nothing. She filled her father's glass when it emptied. She caught Polly's eye for the next course, with a look so practiced it required no words. She noticed that the candle nearest her father was guttering and reached across to trim the wick with her fingers, a motion so habitual she did not flinch at the heat. She kept the meal moving with the invisible competence of a woman who had managed 100 such evenings on a quarter of the resources this one required. Benedict did not address her directly. He addressed the table. He addressed Mr. Graves with the careful respect a younger man owes an elder whose circumstances have diminished and whose dignity has not. He addressed Cecily with the courteous attention a suitor was expected to provide. Once, when Eleanor rose to adjust the fire screen because the draft had shifted and her father was shivering, Benedict's hand moved on the table. His fingers opened against the cloth, then closed again. He looked at her back, at the line of her neck where the cameo sat, at the way she knelt to the grate without hesitation and fixed the thing that needed fixing with her bare hands, while the rest of the table continued talking. And then he looked away before she turned. His jaw held. She did not see it. She had long since stopped expecting anyone at a table to watch her do what she did. She returned to her seat, adjusted the napkin in her lap, and resumed the silence she had carried into the room like a garment she had put on and could not remove. The following morning, Benedict walked the grounds before the house was awake. He did not walk toward the ornamental garden, which Cecily had recommended the evening before, with an enthusiasm that was clearly rehearsed. He walked toward the kitchen garden on the east side of the house, where the cabbages were still standing, and the herb beds had been recently weeded, the rows neat and deliberate, each plant staked with a strip of cloth torn from what looked like an old bedsheet. He found Eleanor on her knees, in the cold dirt at 6:30 in the morning, tying back the rosemary that the wind had flattened overnight. Her breath was visible in the October air. Her fingers were raw. She wore a wool shawl over her working dress that had been mended at the shoulder with thread that did not quite match. She spoke to the plants as she worked. Not in the fanciful way of a girl performing for an audience, she imagined, in the plain, practical way of a woman taking inventory. "The thyme will not survive the first hard frost," she said to no one. "The lavender might if I cut it back before November." She pulled a handful of spent stems and held them to her face and breathed in, and the gesture, the closed eyes and the careful inhalation, was so private, so anchored to a memory older than the moment, that Benedict's hand went to the gatepost and gripped it until his knuckles paled. She was not performing. She did not know he was there. She was simply a woman in a garden, tending what remained, speaking to the lavender the way one speaks to someone who cannot answer. He could have turned away. He stayed. She saw him when she turned to reach for the twine, and she rose quickly, wiping her hands on her apron, and the flush that climbed her throat was visible even in the gray light. "My lord, I did not expect anyone at this hour." "Sit down," he said. It was not a greeting. It was not an invitation. She looked at him with the wariness of a woman unaccustomed to commands that did not concern a task. "I beg your pardon?" "You have been kneeling on frozen ground for an hour," he said, his voice carrying no inflection that she could read as warmth or as anything other than statement. "Your hands are red. Sit on the bench." She did not sit. She folded her hands behind her back and stood very straight. And the discipline in her posture was so precisely identical to his that the air between them held the recognition, like a struck bell holds its note. Neither of them moved. "The garden does well," he said, after a silence that lasted too long for courtesy. "It does," she said. "It is the only thing left that does." She had not meant to say it. The honesty surprised them both, and she turned back to the rosemary before he could respond, and he stood at the gate and watched her work for another full minute before he made himself walk away. Lady Ashworth arrived 3 days into the visit, 2 days earlier than expected, because Lady Ashworth did not trust courtships she could not personally supervise. She descended from her carriage in a traveling cloak lined with dark fur and surveyed Graves Hall with the expression of a woman who had consented to a lesser match only because her son had refused every greater one offered across 2 London seasons and a summer in Bath. The house did not impress her. The front steps needed repointing. The drawing room furniture was a generation out of fashion, and the fire, though lit, could not entirely defeat the damp in the walls. Cecily impressed her in the moderate way that a prospective investment impresses a cautious banker. The girl was pretty. The girl was biddable. The girl would learn. Eleanor did not impress her at all. "You must be the elder Miss Graves," Lady Ashworth said at dinner that evening, seated at the place of honor Mr. Graves had surrendered without being asked. Her gaze moved across Eleanor's gray dress, the roughened hands, the cameo at the throat that she identified with a glance as paste and porcelain rather than pearl. "The one who keeps house." She said it with the precision of a woman who understood categories and applied them the way others applied locks. Eleanor held her gaze for 2 seconds longer than was comfortable. "I am, my lady. Would you care for more wine?" The refusal to flinch, The steady redirect, the absence of any plea for sympathy or recognition, occupied the silence the way a single clear note fills a room when the other instruments have stopped. Cecily filled the quiet with a bright question about the Trevane Gardens. Mr. Graves studied his plate. Benedict's jaw tightened, a movement so slight that only someone watching his face with focused attention would have caught it. And Eleanor was not watching him, because she had trained herself long ago to stop looking at doorways through which no one came for her. What she did not know was that he had been watching her since the garden. With the fixed, quiet attention of a man who has seen something he was not meant to see, and cannot stop returning to it, he tracked the cameo at her throat, the way a compass needle answers north. Not because he chose to, because the mechanism inside him had been tripped and could not be unset. He stood when she entered rooms. He registered the precise moment she left them. He noticed that she ate last and least, that she refilled every glass at the table before her own, that her chair was always the one nearest the door, because she was always the first to rise when something in the house needed tending. He noticed all of this, and Eleanor noticed none of it. Because her wound was not the wound of a woman who had been rejected. It was the wound of a woman who had never been considered. And that wound does not teach you to look for what you have never been given reason to expect. It was Eleanor who found the letter. She had not been looking for it. She had gone to the study after the household was dark to retrieve the ledger, because the butcher's account was 3 weeks overdue, and she needed to calculate whether they could cover it from the quarter's rents or whether she would have to sell the last of her mother's table linen, the good damask with the embroidered edges, the set her mother had hemmed herself the year Eleanor was born. The letter was on the desk, half covered by a map her father had been pretending to study that afternoon, and it bore the Ashworth seal in dark red wax. She did not read it. She moved it aside, opened the drawer, and found the locked cash box already open, the small brass key still in the lock, turned. Someone had been here before her. Inside the box, beneath the ledger with its pressed lavender, lay a second letter in her father's hand. It was dated 3 months prior, addressed to Lady Ashworth, and it had never been posted. It began with an apology for the presumption of writing directly. It ended with a figure, £3,000, the sum her father owed the Trevane estate from a loan taken the year her mother died, the year the roof had needed replacing, and the harvest had failed, and the cook had been the first of 7 servants to leave without being replaced. £3,000, and the only currency the Graves family had left to discharge it was a beautiful daughter and a willing Marquis. Eleanor placed the letter back inside the box. She closed the lid. She locked the drawer and slipped the key into the pocket of her dress. She stood alone in the dark study with the ledger pressed against her chest and the faint scent of lavender lifting from its pages, and she understood, with the cold clarity that arrives only when the last comfortable pretense has been stripped from a room, that Benedict had not come to Graves Hall because he wanted Cecily. He had come because his mother had purchased a girl with a debt and dressed the transaction as a courtship. If this story has settled into your chest the way it settled into Eleanor's, stay. The worst is not yet over, and neither is the best. Benedict found her in the kitchen an hour later. She was kneading bread with a force that had nothing to do with dough. The kitchen was cold, the fire banked low for the night, and the single tallow candle on the work table threw her shadow long and unsteady against the flagstones. Her sleeves were pushed past her elbows, and the flour on her wrists looked like ash in the weak light. He stood in the doorway. She did not look up. "You should not be in the kitchen, my lord," she said. "Your mother would consider it beneath you." "Eat something," he said. "You have not eaten since noon." "I am not hungry." "Miss Graves." His voice was low, and the use of her name carried a weight that had nothing to do with formality and everything to do with the fact that he had, until this moment, avoided using it. "Sit down." She looked up. Her eyes were bright, and the brightness was not tears. It was fury held behind glass so thin he could see the fracture lines. "Is my sister a settlement to you?" she said. "Is she a line in a ledger, to be transferred when the account comes clear?" The silence that followed was the first honest silence the house had held since his arrival. He stepped inside the kitchen. He closed the door behind him. He sat down at the scarred oak table where servants had once gathered for their meals, and he placed both hands flat on the surface, and she could see in the way his fingers pressed the wood, the tendons standing, that whatever he was about to say would cost him something he had been refusing to spend for a long time. "I had a brother," he said. "Edward. He was 22. He was serving with the regiment in the peninsula, and I was meant to purchase his commission out before the winter campaign began. I had the funds. I had the letter written and sealed. I delayed 1 week because I was settling another obligation I believed more urgent, a property dispute my solicitor told me could not wait. And the dispatch came on a Tuesday morning in November. His voice did not change pitch. His hands did not move. I have spent 2 years settling other people's obligations because it is the only arithmetic I understand now. Your father's debt was one of them. My mother's arrangement for your sister was another. I did not come here to collect Cecily, Miss Graves." He looked at her for the first time since entering the room, and his face was open in a way she had not witnessed before. Open the way a door is open when someone has finally put their shoulder to swollen wood and the frame has given. "I came because I did not know how else to discharge what I owed, and because my mother told me this was the next obligation on the list, and I have been moving through the list for 2 years without once asking myself whether the list was mine." His hand went to his breast pocket, where something small and hard pressed against the wool. She could see the outline of a watch case through the fabric. He touched it with his fingertips the way she touched the lavender. Briefly, as though confirming it was still present. He did not open it. He did not explain. He rose from the table, and he left the kitchen without looking back. And Eleanor stood with flour dusting her wrists, and her breath coming shallow, and the bread abandoned on the board, and she understood that what she had read as coldness in him was not indifference. It was the rigid posture of a man who believed he had forfeited the right to want anything for himself, because the last time he had wanted something, it had died in a foreign field, waiting for him to act. The assembly at Barton Cross was Lady Ashworth's construction from its first candle to its last champagne glass. She had organized it within a week of her arrival, deploying the Trevane name and wine shipped from the estate's London cellars, and the stated purpose was to present Cecily to the county as the future Marchioness of Trevane. Invitations had been dispatched to every family of standing within 10 miles. The assembly room had been dressed with hothouse flowers that had cost more than the Graves household spent on provisions in a month. Cecily had been fitted for a new gown of ivory silk, selected and paid for by Lady Ashworth, with the particular generosity of a woman dressing an acquisition she intended to display. Musicians had been engaged. The candles filled 3 iron chandeliers and cast the kind of warm, expensive light that makes every face in a room look worthy of the occasion. Eleanor had not been fitted for anything. She wore her gray silk, turned twice and let down at the hem, and the cameo, and she stood at the edge of the assembly room the way she had always stood at the edges of rooms, with her back near the wall and her hands folded and her face composed into the careful stillness of a woman who had agreed, years ago, to be invisible so that the people she loved could be seen. Pemberton, the magistrate's wife, leaned toward Mrs. Whitfield near the refreshment table and said, in a voice pitched to carry just far enough, The elder Miss Graves, still hovering at the margins. One does wonder whether the girl understands her place is in the kitchen and not a ballroom. Eleanor heard it. She did not move. She watched Cecily cross the room on Benedict's arm, golden and luminous, and entirely unaware of the machinery that had produced this evening. And she felt, for the first time since her mother's death, that the composure she had worn like armor for 3 years might not hold through the next quarter hour. The fury she had carried from the study, the tenderness she had carried from the kitchen, the grief she had brought from the garden at dawn, pressing behind her ribs, all of it gathering against her like water behind a wall that has held too long. Lady Ashworth rose from her chair at the center of the room. She stood with the authority of a woman who had never been denied anything she publicly requested, and she announced, in a voice pitched to reach every corner of the assembly, that she was pleased to confirm the engagement of her son, the Marquis of Trevane, to Miss Cecily Graves of Graves Hall, to be formalized before Christmas. The room applauded. Cecily's face brightened with a smile that was partly relief and partly genuine pleasure. Mr. Graves, seated near the far wall with his stick propped against his chair, closed his eyes. Benedict stood beside Cecily and did not speak. And his silence was not the silence of a man who agrees. Eleanor's glass tilted in her hand. A thin line of champagne ran across her knuckles and fell to the floor in a single drop, and she set the glass down on the nearest ledge with the precision of a woman who would not permit herself even the minor spectacle of a dropped glass. And she walked out. She walked steadily and without haste, out of the assembly room and through the corridor and past the cloakroom where she collected her mantle, and out the front door into the October night. She did not run. She did not weep. The cold struck her throat and her wrists and the bare triangle of skin above the cameo, and she stood on the stone steps and let it take what it wanted, because she was not going back inside that room. She was not going to stand beside the wall and watch the debt her father had hidden, be dressed in ivory silk and called a love match. She was not going to pretend. That was her choice, and it cost her the last of the shelter she had spent 3 years earning, and she made it with her hands steady and her eyes dry and her back as straight as the woman in the cameo. Benedict saw her leave. He saw the glass tilt. He saw the champagne on her knuckles and the way she set it down without a tremor, without a sound. He saw her walk out of the light and the music and the room his mother had built around a debt, and something in him that had been sealed since the Tuesday morning the dispatch arrived opened. Not gently. The way ice opens when the current beneath it has been moving all winter and the surface can no longer pretend to hold. He withdrew his arm from Cecily's. He did not look at his mother. He looked at the room, at the faces, at the same witnesses who had applauded his mother's announcement 30 seconds earlier, and he said, in a voice that was low and level, and carried the particular authority of a man who has stopped performing a part he never agreed to play, "I wish to marry Eleanor, not her sister." 9 words. The room stopped. Lady Ashworth's hand flew to the pearls at her throat, and her mouth opened, and the sound that emerged was not a word. It was the start of a sentence that collapsed when she saw her son's face and understood that what she found there was not confusion. It was not rebellion. It was certainty, the expression of a man who has finally permitted himself to choose and will not be recalled from the choosing. Cecily turned. Her smile was still half-formed, and comprehension arrived across her features, the way light crosses a room. Slowly, reaching different surfaces at different moments. Mr. Graves opened his eyes. Mrs. Whitfield set down her glass, and the click of crystal on wood sounded in the silence, like a stone dropped into still water. Mrs. Pemberton's hand went to her mouth. The musicians, who had been about to start the next set, lowered their instruments. Benedict did not repeat himself. He did not explain. He did not look at his mother again. He walked across the assembly room in 4 strides, past the hothouse flowers she had ordered, past the champagne she had shipped, past the ivory gown she had purchased, and the future she had built on £3,000, and a girl who had never once been asked whether she wished to be the currency that settled a debt. He reached the corridor. He reached the front door. Eleanor stood on the stone steps with her mantle around her shoulders and the October cold in her loosened hair. And she turned when the door opened behind her. And her face was not composed. It was open. It was the face from the window, the unguarded one, the one she wore only when she believed no one was watching. "Come inside," he said. "No," she said. Her voice was steady. "I will not go back into that room." "Not that room?" he said. He held out his hand. Behind him, through the open door, the assembly's silence was already fracturing into voices. Lady Ashworth's voice, pitched high and unsteady for the first time in living memory. Cecily's voice, thin and bewildered and carrying, beneath the bewilderment, something that sounded very nearly like relief. Mr. Graves calling for his stick. The crowd revising what they had witnessed, the applause of a minute ago dissolving into murmurs that would become the county's settled story by morning. Mrs. Whitfield was the first to say aloud what the room had begun to understand, and what she said, to Mrs. Pemberton and to anyone else who cared to listen, was, "Well, I suppose it was always Eleanor, was it not? We simply were not paying attention." Benedict's hand remained extended. His other hand rested against his breast pocket, against the watch, and Eleanor could see the tremor in his fingers, the small visible cost of a man who had not allowed himself to reach for anything in 2 years, choosing now to reach. She took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and deliberate and steady in a way the rest of him was not, and she could feel through her own cold skin the ridge of the watch case pressing through the wool, the outline of whatever he carried there. And she understood that the hand holding hers was the same hand that had sealed a letter 1 week too late, and that it was not too late now, and that he knew it, and that knowing it was the reason he was shaking. The solicitor arrived from London 4 days after the assembly. The debt was discharged, not as a condition of marriage. As a separate settlement, Mr. Graves would repay over 7 years at terms that preserved his house and his pride. The engagement was announced quietly, without champagne, without spectacle, without Lady Ashworth's involvement. She had departed Graves Hall before dawn the morning after the assembly, her carriage loaded in darkness, and the only evidence of her visit was a set of linen napkins she had brought from Trevane, and did not send for. Cecily wept for 1 evening, then grew very still. And on the second morning she came to the kitchen, where Eleanor was making pastry, and stood in the doorway and said, "I was not heartbroken, Eleanor. I was playing a part someone else had written for me. I think I had been playing it so long I forgot I never chose it." She said it plainly, her face younger than it had looked in months now that the performance had ended. And Eleanor believed her, because Cecily's relief was the same quiet relief Eleanor had seen on the faces of servants released from houses they had been too loyal to leave on their own. Mr. Graves sat in his study that afternoon with the door open for the first time in over a year, and when Eleanor brought him his tea, he took her hand and held it, and said nothing. And the nothing held more than the words he had failed to say when saying them might have spared her. The wedding was small. It was held at the parish church in Barton Cross on a morning in late November when the frost had silvered the churchyard stones and the breath of the congregation hung in the nave like gauze. Mrs. Whitfield sat in the third pew and pressed a handkerchief to her eyes without embarrassment. Mrs. Pemberton attended and was observed, for the first recorded occasion, to maintain her silence through an entire service. Cecily stood at her sister's side in a dress she had chosen herself, paid for from pin money she had saved across 2 years of a courtship she had never wanted, and she held Eleanor's gloves during the vows with hands that did not shake. Polly wept openly at the back of the church, and did not apologize for it. Mr. Graves walked his elder daughter down the aisle on his stick, slowly, and when he placed her hand in Benedict's, his own hand was steadier than it had been in a year, as though the act of giving her to a man who had chosen her freely, rather than delivering her to an arrangement purchased with shame, had returned to him something the debt and the silence and the grief had taken. That evening, in the house at Trevane that was now also hers, Eleanor stood at a window. Not the window at Graves Hall, where he had first seen her with a cloth in her hand and gold light on her face. A different window, tall and clean, set into the west wall of the library, with glass that needed no cleaning and a view of grounds whose names she would learn across the years to come. The fire in the grate behind her was steady and well tended by hands that were not hers, and the room smelled of old leather and beeswax and the particular warmth of a house that has been cared for by people who were paid enough to care. Benedict came to stand beside her. He did not speak. He placed something on the stone windowsill beside her hand, and she looked down and saw the watch. It was small and plain, its silver case worn smooth at the edges from years of being held and carried and touched through the cloth of a coat pocket. She opened it. Inside was not a clock face. It was a miniature, painted in the careful hand of a decade past, of a young man with Benedict's jaw and softer, kinder eyes. Edward. She closed the watch gently and placed it on the sill, and from the pocket of her dress she drew the sprig of lavender. It was dry and pale and translucent at the edges, and it should have lost its scent 3 years ago. It had not. She laid it beside the watch, and the 2 small objects rested together on the cold stone ledge. The brother and the mother. The late letter and the pressed flower, with the November dark pressing against the glass, and the firelight casting their joined shadows forward across the sill. Neither Eleanor nor Benedict spoke for a long time, because the silence in that room was not the silence of a house where no one speaks. It was the silence of a house where everything that needed saying had already been said, in 9 words, in a room full of witnesses who had finally learned to look at the woman they had spent years not seeing. The fire cracked and settled. The lavender held. The window kept the cold on the far side of the glass where it belonged. And Eleanor Ashworth, who had been the elder Miss Graves, who had been the one who kept house, who had been the girl at the margins no one thought to thank, stood in her own library, in her own home, and did not need to clean a thing. Thank you for staying with her until she arrived here. If her story left a mark, a quiet word below would mean the world.